Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here to review Carthage by Joyce Carol Oates. This novel is about a small community called Carthage, where a young girl goes missing. 19-year-old Cressida is the youngest daughter of the Mayfield family, who are a very prominent family in Carthage, and one night she disappears completely. The clues pretty much immediately lead to a decorated Iraqi war veteran who suffered a traumatic brain injury, and was also the ex-fiancé of Cressida's older sister. The book follows the discovery of what happened to Cressida and why, and also a community and particularly a family in grieving. I gave this book 4 stars, but I had very mixed feelings about it. There was one point in the book where I had decided to give it 2 stars because it was very boring, I wasn't down with the writing style, and it just seemed to be going on and on forever. And then there was a point where I contemplated giving this book 5 stars because it was utterly amazing. So I settled on 4 as kind of a middle ground between the two, but I'm still not quite sure how I feel about this book or if that's the correct rating. I think the first thing to discuss is Joyce Carol Oates' writing style. It's very odd. She has a very fragmented way of writing. She'll say a sentence, a normal sentence, and then continue on with fragmented details about that thought. It can feel like a bit too much at some times, and by at some times I mean generally most of the time it feels like too much, and you have to always focus to keep track of where the fragments are attached to get the whole thought. It's a bit jarring to read, but it also kept me more engaged in the story than I'm used to, or at least engaged in a different way, because I was so fascinated by the writing style, and it was so odd and different. Which is not to say that I loved it, but I was fascinated by it. The second odd note about the narration is that the narration keeps a distance from the main characters. They're often referred to as the father or the bride-to-be, the sister. And there's not this closeness. While you do get their thoughts, you're not exactly in their head as you would often expect to be. And I'd never quite seen that before when it comes to point of view characters. While again, I'm not entirely sure how well it worked within the story, it was fascinating to read. For the first 150 pages or so, I was very interested in this book because of that unique writing style and storytelling. I'm not sure how well it worked for the story. I'm not sure if I enjoyed reading it because I thought it was well done and it was making the story interesting or better, or if I enjoyed it more as a study of creative writing, as a creative writing exercise. Because I am very interested in writing styles and reading new ones. It did kind of feel like an assignment for a class in that way, where I was reading it to study it and discuss it, and not so much because I was enjoying the story itself. And for that reason, I have a hard time saying it was good or that I enjoyed the writing style. It was just very different and fascinating to me. This was the first Joyce Carol Oates book that I've ever read, and I do plan to read a second one because I feel like with a second one, I'll have a better understanding of if I'm enjoying the story and the writing style on its own, or if I just enjoyed the study of it because it was so new and fresh to me. The second section lost my interest entirely. 2 of the characters at one point go on a tour of a prison facility, and it turns into a very long anti-death penalty tirade, essentially. I don't remember how long it was, but it felt like it went on forever, and I just slogged through that section because it felt so removed from the story of the book. It was still connected in the broadest of senses, but it didn't contribute anything to the story, and it felt like something that existed for a very specific bit of imagery instead of actually contributing to the story, and it was so dull and boring. At that point, I was very disillusioned with her writing style, and I wanted nothing more than to put this book down. That was the point where I decided this was a 2-star read, and after enjoying the reading of her unique writing style, I was very over it by that point in the story. Joyce Carol Oates has a strange way of not being preachy, but still being very obvious in her views, because I wouldn't call this book preachy, but at the same time, it was very overtly anti-death penalty, anti-Iraq war or war on terror, and anti the current prison system. But it wasn't preachy. It was just exploring all the negative aspects of all of these things, and while I do agree on all of those thoughts to some extent, it felt unnecessarily pointed in this book, and it was a little bit off-putting to read. Like, I didn't want a tirade that was anti-capital punishment. I agree with that, and I understand its importance as a discussion, but for this book, it didn't work, and it made it very boring and dull, and took away from the story itself. I don't think subtlety is Joyce Carol Oates' strong suit, but if it is, it definitely did not show in this book. And then we got to the section on 19-year-old Cressida's past. Essentially, through middle school and high school, particularly high school and a bit of college, we learned from her point of view what happened and what it was like for her and her thought process. And this was the section of the story that I wanted to give 5 stars. I don't know how long it was, maybe about 80 pages, but it was fascinating to read. I was utterly enthralled. It was so beautiful, so stunning. And that was the section that made me realize this is why Joyce Carol Oates is famous. This is why people enjoy her books. And that was the section of the story that made this book 4 stars for me. Is that really fair? Should this book perhaps have been 3 stars instead of 4 stars since there was so much I didn't like? Maybe. That's quite possible. But for that section, it was amazing. It was 5 star. I was so hooked on that. I couldn't put it down. And it was beautiful. The odd writing style worked so well for Cressida's character. I don't think that it worked particularly well for the rest of the characters and the rest of the story, but when Cressida was speaking, it was beautiful. It sounded like her voice. It sounded like the way she would talk and the way a person like her would tell her story. And I absolutely adored that. And I wish the rest of the book had been as beautiful as that, because I would have loved to read 500 pages of that instead of 500 pages of anti-war, anti-prison, anti-capital punishment that seemed to drag on forever. I binged the last 100 pages after that section because I was so drawn into the story at that point. But again, it kind of returned to the beginning, where it was just a little bit too dull. I was disillusioned by the writing style. I'd read it, so it wasn't new and interesting to me, and I just sort of lacked interest in anything except for Cressida. I was still addicted to the idea of the story, but I wasn't loving it or really enjoying it all that much, like I was with Cressida's section. But Cressida's history was beautiful, and it felt unfair to that section to rate this book anything less than 4 stars. I did enjoy the ending. It ended differently than I expected it to, which sometimes happens with literary fiction, because it doesn't have to give you the most satisfying ending. And while I wouldn't consider this a great work of literature, it was very interesting to read, and the ending left me with a lot of thoughts on a variety of characters. I thought it was a wonderful way to end the story and still have me thinking about it. It's been about 2 days since I read this book, and I'm still thinking about it. I still have a lot of complex feelings on it. I have a difficult time saying this was a good book, or this was even a great book, or really recommending this book to anyone. I think I wanted my best friend to read it, and she got through about 3 pages and said she was done. And I think a lot of people would feel that way. I think I kind of felt that way at a point, but I had to give it 4 stars. I just had to, despite everything about it that was odd and boring and not altogether enjoyable. I was fascinated. I don't know if that fascination will continue with the next book of hers that I read, because I'll definitely be reading a second one, and I don't know that she'll be an author that I pick up a lot, but I'm glad I read this. It was worthwhile, if only for how interesting and different it was, and I'm really looking forward to reading a book of American martyrs, because I'd like to know more of how I feel about Joyce Carol Oates. I do think a lot of people would be bored or irritated by this. I don't think this is a great literary masterpiece. I think there were a lot of flaws, a lot of negatives, and a lot of aspects of the book that weren't done well. I don't think the ableism within the book was necessarily covered well. I don't think Joyce Carol Oates' political views were written well. There has to be a sort of subtlety to them, and they have to work well enough within the story, and I don't think they did in this book. But Cressida's character was beautiful, and for me, that was enough. Let me know down below if you read Carthage, or honestly anything by Joyce Carol Oates, because I never have before, and I've heard her talked about a lot. Her name was very familiar to me, but I couldn't place any specific details or what the conversations were about. So I'd love to hear more thoughts down below if you're familiar with this author, because this was my first foray into her works, and I'm really still not sure how I felt about it. 4 stars seems too high for this book, but 3 stars also seems too low, so I went with 4 stars. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.